Okay, I'm Patrick Doyle from the Inter-American Development Bank and in the private sector lending arm. So I'm going to echo some of the same themes that have been mentioned. But we in the private sector arms of the multilaterals and all the MDBs have them, the IFC is the World Bank's arm, are kind of intermediaries between the private sector and the public sector. We lend at market rates with our own ordinary capital. We take some more risks than commercial banks, but we act like commercial banks, and the governments are our owners, just like they are of the World Bank, but they don't really accept losses. So we tend to be more conservative than we need to be when we're supporting climate change investments, which is why I'm focusing here on what we do with the international climate funds and the donor funds to actually make a difference and have financial additionality in getting the private sector to invest. So we combine those funds with our own capital, but just to set up who we are. And in the IDB's private sector arm, we lend to corporates directly, which includes utilities. We lend for infrastructure projects, and we also lend to private equity funds and local banks. And we've lent about half of our lending over the last few years has gone towards renewables, primarily large-scale renewables. Increasingly solar, but it's in the past you would say it's a lot more hydro, biofuels, and wind. I think we've gone over the barriers, so I don't want to harp too much on the barriers. I would just mention on that same theme, what we receive from international donors is mostly concessional debt, which is higher risk debt and lower cost debt. We receive some grant funds generally when we get money from the Green Climate Fund or the Clean Technology Fund or others, or the JEF, but it tends to be 5 to 10% of the project costs, so it's not really used for investment grants. You can't do a large-scale energy efficiency appliance subsidy program with the amount of funding we receive. What we do is a lot of technical assistance, either to banks or audits and renewable energy project feasibility studies. So we have, the IDB has been pretty active, and obviously there's more maturity in most of the countries with the local financial markets. And we have all the range of different products. I'm going to focus here on some of the products that didn't work actually, and so we can see what things have failed, because I think it's important that we all look at the true track record on what's happened in order to keep getting better with what we're doing with these funds. So we have more success, so they don't take so long to roll out. So I think this is echoing what Torben was saying about the enabling environment, and what I was saying about the bridge. Basically, at the bottom of the period, you're talking about then having the right conditions necessary to attract the private sector investment, which is primarily done by the governments and regulators. Then using some donor funding to overcome those information barriers to let people know that these projects have returns and make sense. And then the concessional finance along with our ordinary capital, hopefully bringing in the large amount of private investment. It's just examples of the energy efficiency audits we do. So one of the funds we have is actually in Copenhagen. Canada was one of the countries that pledged Fast Start Finance, and they put $250 million in the IDB. And so we've used that basically to overcome risk and cost barriers. Again, primarily for large-scale solar projects, first-of-kind projects. But I'm going to show here is an example of energy efficiency. And I wanted to focus on this for a second because of what Jigar Shah mentioned with new build energy efficiency. And what are the challenges in trying to figure out how much subsidy you should give, what kind of subsidy you should give, and how you get a university in this case, which is building a $30 million university, to make it as green as possible. In this case, we tried to estimate the cost of what we thought would be additional costs to become more energy efficient up front of about $1.5 million. To date, they haven't spent all of that in qualifying ways, so we basically lent them the money, but if they don't use it how they're supposed to, they have to pay it back at much higher interest rate. But I mean, new build, as Jigar said, you have to figure out what is the baseline in a country, and it can be very complicated if you want to take a very stringent measure of that. And then you have to figure out whether the results were achieved. So in this case, as it's basically performance-based payments, as you've heard, as they achieve a higher degree of LEED certification, and LEED is the measure we use because it's very common in Latin America, they get a discount on the interest rate. The other thing that's we didn't mention and would take some time, but is local currency. Local currency finance can be very expensive. Currency risk is something that we often can't take, and it makes a big difference if the donors can actually take local currency risk. So I think we mentioned Jigger's comments about new build energy efficiency and how to incentivize it. Let me go through a couple other case studies here. We have a $100 million fund that's supported by the Nordic Development Fund and the Climate Investment Funds. They basically give a first loss guarantee to us, and that's a direct guarantee that we're able to pass on the savings to the clients, and we're able to prove that these are the cost and risk barriers that we overcome. We generally only provide 50% of the total debt package, though, so we look for other co-investors in these deals, and they can lend through us or they can be alongside us. What are some of the things that a first loss guarantee does? It overcomes credit barriers. I mean, companies have limited collateral. They can't go back to the bank for another loan, or they aren't willing to go back to the bank for another loan because they have other priority investments. So if you can lend without collateral or with just collateral over the equipment itself, that makes a big difference in convincing companies to invest. Obviously, with the first loss guarantee, as long as generally these guarantee programs, one of the issues is that the banks have to pay for the guarantee, and if the bank has to give up a share of its revenue to the to you for the guarantee, they're often not willing to do that. They say, well, I have 50% at risk. Why should I give up half the spread just because you're giving me a 50% guarantee? So again, this is more a very deep finance topic, but if it's important when we're rolling out these programs that we, at some point, really look at the details on what's going to be necessary to get banks to invest in projects they wouldn't do otherwise, right? If they're doing something they're doing otherwise, but just with a subsidy, then we're not really having the impact. And tenors, obviously, solar projects. I mean, I was surprised IKEA said 8-year paybacks are acceptable. That's really an institutional choice, right? Because most of the big companies, including the big names that you hear around the world, would say at the plant level, you get to the plant manager, he says, well, I can't go more than 3-year payback up to corporate, forget it, I can't even try. So I say, well, what if I give you super cheap debt for that? And can I incentivize you to at least try and to get some special line for that project to prioritize it? And then legal costs can be a challenge for smaller loans. Energy efficiency, we talked about, big challenges is getting the packages together. So here's 3 case studies. One, this is actually, I think it's the largest rooftop solar project in Latin America still. It's 3 megawatts. It's on the supplier of Pepsi in San Pedro Sula, Honduras. First of kind project, and obviously the largest project in that area. So we had a first loss guarantee from the Nordic Development Fund that helped us get that project done. So this project we just closed, it's energy efficiency cogeneration, but it's using the waste trees from an orange producer in Costa Rica and Nicaragua. So the barriers there are, one, it's an energy efficiency technology, it's biomass, but you're recapturing all the waste heat. But feedstock, is that feedstock going to be there for the long term? One of the key issues of biomass technologies. And then because of climate risks, basically, this company's had, they supply all the Minute Maid orange juice in the U.S. to Coca-Cola, right? So they have a great offtake agreement, good contracts, but they've had really bad production years up and down, and they can't get access to finance at this point. Even though this project pays back in some 3 to 4 years, they can't access the finance they need to do that at this point, in part perhaps because of climate change impacts and unseasonable rains coming at the wrong time. So we, with first loss guarantee here again, we're able to take that risk and provide an 8-year loan to allow them to implement the project. We didn't have other outside co-financiers interested, but we used the Canadian Climate Fund as an additional co-financier to be able to provide 75% of the total project costs. And then we talked about municipalities a little bit. This project we just closed with Optima Energia, which was an IFC client. Now it's our client, but couldn't take this much risk this time. But
you didn't just steal them from us.
well, they took a loan from the IFC, and they were trying to take a loan from OPIC. So other development finance institutions that wanted to take risk, but they couldn't go back to them for financing. Because the business model, this is basically an ESCO that was the most successful ESCO in Latin America. I mean, we have another program financing ESCOs in Brazil. So, I mean, we have insight into where ESCOs are throughout Latin America, and it's not that pretty a picture. I mean, so if you look at Optima Energia, it was very successful in the hotel sector in Cancun. Well, was successful. I can't say very successful. They obviously had some issues with getting the projects to pay back and keeping the afloat, but they decided to go after the municipal lighting sector. So this is the first entirely off-balance sheet municipal LED lighting upgrade that's paid for entirely by the savings. So Optima Energia didn't put in much equity. It's basically 95% debt. But the savings from LED lighting, as we've heard, are so great that you can pay back a 10-year loan easily with those savings. And Mexico has has some unique laws in place that allow the utility that collects those lighting payments to divert those payments directly to a trust fund, directly to pay the debt. So you don't have to wait for the city to pay its bills or rely on the municipal credit risk. We didn't have to evaluate the credit risk of the municipality at all in this case. We could just rely on the CFE, the utility, passing those savings along to pay off our loan. But we did have first loss guarantees from the Clean Technology Fund, and we had the Canadian Climate Fund alongside us to get to an 85% debt threshold from us, and then there's 10% from another private equity fund that's taking subordinated debt at a significant interest rate. So I think Ashok and everyone highlighted, we do have a lot of planet banking green lines where we lend at market rates to banks, but we probably have two cases where it's actually successful in getting the bank to lend for energy efficiency. One is Banco General in Panama, and we'd like to talk about that one, but every other line, we probably have 8 other lines. It's basically going to large-scale renewables because that's what's easy for the banks to do, lower transaction costs. So if you want a bank to lend for energy efficiency, like we're going to do with IFC in Costa Rica, you really have to provide a lot of technical assistance, go out to their clients, do the audits, really try to get the bank interested and perhaps subsidize directly some of the administrative costs that's required. So this Brazil, we have, just to give another example of a project that didn't quite work so well so far, we have from the GEF basically 100% loan guarantees we can provide there in Brazil. We've used 1.6 million or so of the 25 million available, 10 million from the GEF and 15 from us. So there hasn't been that much interest, in part because of complications in using guarantees and banks' unwillingness to pay for that guarantee. Anyway, we could talk later about particular issues there. We also can issue performance guarantees there, and we haven't had any client demanding a performance guarantee. And then in Colombia, initially, there was a CTF program that was planned for 100 million along with IFC. We were going to take 50% risk, as I was saying. This program it dispersed a small amount, but it was never really successful because Bancolombia wasn't interested there was no first loss given to the Bancolombia. They were still 50%, and they weren't interested really in giving away and paying for this guarantee when they were taking 50% of the risk. So now what we're doing, as Ashok mentioned, is we're developing a specialized fund that's going to lend for energy efficiency directly with about $30 million and using that CTF money for that instead of trying it with another bank. In Chile, it's the same thing. The last thing I just wanted to mention is that, when I market the donors anyway, the Green Climate Fund is now a new donor. We can't only focus on leverage and not having a lot of risk. I think if a donor wants to be financially additional and wants to maximize the impact of their funds, well, if they have a low risk tolerance and they basically want 10 times leverage or even 8 times leverage or more, that basically tips this chair over, right? You don't have much financial additionality in those cases. So I'm trying to show here that, look, if you want high leverage, then you better take a lot of risk. You better be first loss guarantees, equity type of risk, and in that case, maybe you're going to have 10 times leverage. Otherwise, if you want lower risk, well, then you need to come in cheaper, or you need to do something that we can't do on our own. Thanks.